Hi, everyone. So topic 3, reframing sustainability. I'm just going to start with a little opening. The narrative around sustainable design seems stuck on recyclability, reducing impacts, and circular design. While we're not against any of these ideas, in fact, anything that can be done to improve now should be, we would like to propose that as a profession, we start to consider more radical aims. As long as we're still in the model of excess production and consumption, can we ever really get ahead of the sustainability challenge? We propose that designers need to fundamentally reframe their role in the economic system. That designers should start thinking seriously about how to drastically reduce consumption and production. So my first guest today is Philip Patberg, a full professor of transnational environmental governance and policy at the Institute for Environmental Studies VU Amsterdam, where he chairs the Environmental Policy Analysis Department. Philip also,
you're with us now.
Hi,
just
Philip.
So you know. Hi there.
Philip also directs VU Amsterdam's transdisciplinary and interfaculty research platform on sustainability at the Amsterdam Sustainability Institute. Philip has published widely on questions of institutional change and transformation, effectiveness and accountability in environmental governance, and he talks a lot about the increasing complexity of sustainability. And then I have Anna Massoud, the Director General of EcoD, who also comes from an industrial design background and who's here today not as a specialist, but to advocate for the view of the Council.
Great, thank you.
So I'm going to start by the first kind of angle that we want to talk about is reshaping consumer desire. And we asked in our intro section, what if our contribution is designing entirely new ways of thinking about consumption altogether? In short, we're asking for a dismantling of systemic ways of thinking when it comes to design. It's not enough to do less harm. A key shift in thinking needs to happen towards regenerative alternatives, but also to think about how designers shape consumer desire. So Philip, I'm going to start with you. Before we get to policy, what are the main logics that you see needing to shift?
Thank you. And first of all, greetings
Philip, I think
to Lithuania. I do have the echo again that we talked about in the beginning. But okay, greetings to Lithuania. It's really nice to be invited. It's a great pleasure. I would have loved to come, but we all know that actually flying out to these conferences is one of the things that we need to change as academics. So happy to do it from my home office. So I also have kids in the living room. So if you hear them scream, it's just because we in the Netherlands are a bit liberal on that. So then don't mind that, please. Okay, so first of all, I want to say that I think you're very bold in making those statements about the purpose of design. And from an outside perspective, I'm a political scientist and maybe an interdisciplinary sustainability scholar, but not a designer. I must say, this is fantastic. This is so bold, it is far-reaching, and you're probably way ahead of the curve. So just that as an introduction. So maybe we are done with the panel because you already know what you need to do. But obviously, probably that's why you invited me. It's not that easy. It's quite complex. And even though we do know what we need to do, we don't really know how to do it. So let's start with this question of what's the foundation and what is maybe wrong. And there are probably two things I would like to highlight to start out with. The first is that we often in our economic life and in our professional life confuse means and ends. So we measure in academia, for example, how many papers I would have written last year and how often those papers are cited. And then you would say, he's a very important person because he has I don't know, so many thousands of citations. And you might think about that, this is really impressive, but actually these are just the means to some ends. Why do I publish? No, because I have some results. And why do I share them in publications? Because I hope that someone reads them. And why do I want people to read them? Because eventually I hope that they will take these insights and do something with them, so generate impact. So actually there's a big difference between the means that we use and the ends that we want to achieve. And the same is true for our economic system, where we measure things like financial assets and money. But those are just means to get things done. And when you ask people, and that has been done around the world in any culture for many, many years, if you ask people, what do you think is important for you? They will universally say things like a healthy environment and my own health. They will say good social relations. And they will talk about fulfilling and meaningful jobs. They will talk about clean air and clean water. They will talk about individual freedom and some form of happiness. No one ever talks about money. No one ever talks about financial assets or your investment portfolio, because these are means to ends. And this is a fundamental problem, because the way we measure our whole economic system, and by extension, the political economy, it's all about the means. So politicians are elected on GDP growth. And GDP growth, as we know, measures all sorts of stuff, but not really what's important. So that's one problem. But at a deeper level, I think that derives from an ideology that we're all part of, a mindset that has been termed expansionist. And the idea is that everything in life needs to break through certain frontiers. And that's true for your individual life curve, right? When I tell you that my career is sort of stable for 30 years and I've never made any advances in my function or in the level of experience or in the amount of control I have, you would probably consider me a failure, because the model that we have is it needs to go up, it needs to be more, it needs to be better, faster. And the same is true for politics and economics. And this expansion isn't only spatial. We spatially expand. So, we messed up the planet and now we go to Mars, right? And then we go beyond and we do that. But it's also ideological. We expand further and deeper into the social, into the fabric of social. So that's everything that once was a caring economy is now a market economy, right? So when you're sick, you have people that take care of you. And all of this is well known. And once that is all done, and this is a classical, critique of capitalism in a way, then you make the metaverse, and then you make an artificial life, and then you go on and capitalize that as well. So now you can do all the things that we've done in real life, and you can spend any frontier there. And that is not in itself a problem, but it becomes a problem on a finite planet. And we are, for all practical purposes, on a finite planet. And one final thing on that, maybe a little thought experiment. It's actually just physics. So our current gross rate of energy use is globally around 2.9% per year, which means every year we use 2.9% more energy than before. So that doesn't sound like much. And most of our models, political models, economic models, and for all practical purposes, what we as normal people and you as designers think is that we can continue that forever. But that's really not true. If you just calculate that, and has been done a paper published in Nature recently on that, is it takes only 1,000 years for us to use the entire energy of the sun. But that cannot be done, because if you would harness the energy of the sun on Earth, thermodynamically, that's impossible. So this is a fixed boundary that can never be crossed. In just 2,400 years, that's basically the times that we sort of have the start of the Roman Empire, just in the future. So that's not that far in the future if you think about it. You can go to the Colosseum in Rome. In 2,400 years, we will have exceeded the total energy of the galaxy, of the Milky Way, if we stay within 2.9% growth per year. Okay, so that is the misunderstanding of expansionism, because nothing can expand forever. And in simple terms, we all grow and then we die. It's a cycle. And of course, any culture knows that. It's all the narratives around that, but we've forgotten that. And this seems to me a fundamental problem, because we tackle this at a very superficial level. So we try to tinker and we try to redo stuff and, a little bit here and there, but the fundamentals are not changing. And that is a big political, social, and ecological problem. So this will be my narrative, but there are many others that try to get a grip on, what's happening at the foundations.
Is how do we get out of the expansionist mindset? And what you're saying about this kind of ideology of infinitude, this sense of endless growth, endless possibility, is kind of projecting us into this possible future that we're talking about design as possibility. But now I'm going to just take it back a bit. to frame the expansionist mindset, we also need to look into the past to some degree. So if we look historically at what the expansionist mindset was based on, in fact, it was deeply tied up in a process called enclosure, in which common lands across Europe were seized, crops burned, and millions of peasants forced away from their livelihoods. Across the global south, lands and bodies were enclosed at a much greater scale. And then the rise of capitalism, which you've touched on, hinged on commodities produced by enslaved workers, on stolen lands stolen from colonized people, and indigenous people dispossessed by enclosure. In other words, bodies appropriated for the sake of surplus accumulation. Okay, so before we sort of figure out how to get out of the expansionist mindset, to what extent do current policies need to reflect these histories of enclosure for expansion? In other words, does there need to be truth before reconciliation and policymaking? That's a big question.
Yeah, thank you. These are big and important questions, and I can only venture a very partial answer. So, your description of the historic roots of the problem very accurate, and I think I could absolutely agree on them. The way in which both land ownership, private ownership has been brought into this mindset of expansionism. The workforce of many people, this all well understood, I think, historically, and it's important to understand that that is in itself an expansion. Although you do enclose, but what you actually do is you take away, parts of the common land, common property, and you make it private. What you actually do is you accumulate ever more energy and sort of work that's not yours to the purposes that you set for that. So you expand the abilities that you have by, for example, appropriating the work of workers instead of doing it yourself. So that is true, and you mentioned the sort of colonial aspect of that and the spatial distribution of responsibility in that. And I think I would say yes, it's important to realize those and study that as a historic fact. Whether we will ever arrive at a truth, the truth, in fact, that would be at the basis of reconciliation, I find that difficult from my own epistemological standpoint, and so I would say that in a sort of more post-structural way, or to refer to Bruno Latour, who died just a couple of days ago. I mean, ontology and epistemology are connected; they're one thing. So there's no way to set the truth and reconcile. This is always an ongoing process of negotiation, and I can only hope that we can find the rules to do that. And that will enable us to make progress. But I would not wait for everyone to understand, the historic responsibilities of the white man, so to speak, before we can move ahead, because that is a difficult proposition, empirically difficult proposition to do.
Certainly. Okay, so we can talk then about the ways in which we do try to move ahead. And so this brings me to greenwashing. The idea that we continue to talk about recycling and better materials is actually a distraction from the real issues, and it's convenient for corporations that use the environment as a central phrase in their marketing campaigns, and yet actually do nothing concrete. So in what ways, in your opinion, can policymaking address the distraction of greenwashing?
Also, a really difficult question. I mean, it sounds much more hands-on in a way, but I think it's quite deep and in a sense and difficult to answer. So I would say that there is a part of a learning curve. I would not per se agree with that every company who builds a narrative around their own sustainability is doing that to deceive the customer or the citizens. I think that might be the case. As an empirical question if that is the case, but it's not universally the case. I think in many instances, and what I know from my own work, working also with small and medium-sized enterprises on the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, where we, for example, use students in some of our teaching programs to go to companies and make a scan, basically, of their activities related to the SDGs, is genuinely learning. I mean, those companies have never thought about these problems and how they relate to those goals. And by doing that, they get an X-ray, and it's sometimes uncomfortable because indeed there are these structural problems there. But I think it's part of a learning curve, and often you start with the low-hanging fruits. So yeah, you recycle, and we all know, yeah, you should first of all, just avoid what's happening, and then you should repurpose and reuse, and only at the very end, when there's still some waste, then you can recycle. But I think that's a learning curve. And if you think about debates on circularity now and 15, 20 years back, there's a real change in there. So I would say, yes, there is a risk that we are stuck with a lot of PR, a lot of advertisement, a lot of greenwashing, and that we think something is happening. But I wouldn't say that's universally the case. And I want to actually explain why. I think it's important to realize that even if a company has bad intentions and they do use sustainability or any sort of claim to the environment as a greenwashing thing, it will haunt them, because people will at one point realize that, and they will hold them accountable. And that has happened through the board on human rights issues with companies, whole sweatshop debate and responsibilities for working conditions in the global south, and has happened with claims around sustainability. And just very recently, probably you read that Burger King was called upon their marketing on meatless burger alternatives that were actually not really true, because they couldn't show that the two product streams were separated generally. So they took away that sort of certification they had. And that is a major PR disaster for a company that tried to rebrand themselves in a way of saying, we also sell meat, but first and foremost, we sell burgers. And that's interesting in itself, because I guess no one would have thought 20 years ago that would be how, all these fast food chains in some markets, not in all markets though, but in some markets operate. So I would say a bit more nuanced greenwashing exists, but it is often called upon by civil society. And that tension is important to move ahead the debate, because that creates genuine learning, it creates competition, and it creates actually the attention that some of those companies need. It's much more dangerous if companies do not communicate about anything and we don't even know they exist, right? Some of these big material mining companies that are involved in some of these these supply chains for modern communication products are so unknown to consumers that they don't even bother to have a strategy on the environment, because no one ever cares to look it up. So I think it's a bit more nuanced, but I do see the problem of greenwashing as potentially distracting us from important transformative work that needs to be done. But I would say there is an element of learning in there that we shouldn't disregard right away.
Do you mind if I just interject here? Because I think one of the issues from the standpoint, we're a professional association that represents designers that are working, right? And I feel most designers, when we're in conversations like this, tell us we want to be more sustainable, but they're stuck in this kind of impossible situation between, what they want to be doing and that they're having to hit certain constraints. They have clients that might not necessarily agree with them. I mean, you brought up the Burger King example. A big one in the design industry recently was H&M, that have they developed a whole new marketing campaign around all the sustainability, where they actually measured the amounts in which they reduced things, and all of those numbers turned out to be lies. Where they said they reduced, it was increased. And but I think there's always this hope somehow from above for designers that there will be, as there is a lot more in Europe than there is in a lot of other places, because keep in mind, a lot of us are not working in Europe, policy that's actually going to enforce a certain minimum bar level of accountability. Is that something that, you actually view as possible, or is that a hope that we have that won't be materialized?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's definitely possible in certain regions and pockets of activity under constraints of accountability and actually checking it. So the EU is notorious for producing a lot of regulation on paper. Compliance is a secondary issue that we need to look into. But yes, there's a real possibility to move those debates along by using some form of top-down regulation, and even you could do it bottom up, right? There are many examples where from the bottom up we have raised the regulatory floor, so to speak, for supply chains around the world. So I'm not saying that doesn't work. It is a good strategy. It's sort of a second best strategy. The best strategy would be to have a different economic system that wouldn't reward this type of behavior in the first place, because that's, I think, where there is this disconnect. Right. So again, if you think about means and about ends, what we want to have is a system that stays within planetary boundaries, that creates a certain amount of fairness and justice and equality, and generally contributes to the good life. And I think anyone agrees to that. You find that in many constitutions around the world, by the way, so it's not controversial at all. No constitution says we want to make money. No one says that. So this is not controversial. What's controversial is how you make that shift to implementing that in the real world. Regulation can help, policy definitely helps, but we need to face the fact, and you mentioned it already, that there are great differences in the world economy in terms of not only compliance, but really regulation, right? So there are more countries that are non-democratic than they're actually democratic countries. And in fact, democracies are declining, rapidly so. The quality of democracy is measured in a number of indices, has been declining over the last 10 years. So it's not only that we have fewer democracies around the world, we have even a deterioration of the quality of democracy. And that's very worrisome, because I wouldn't necessarily think that autocracies are generally green. They use that strategically, but they don't do that for the right reasons, I would say. So to rely on this idea of regulation works in some instances, under some circumstances, but cannot be a panacea for all the problems that we have.
Do you want to say something else, Anna, about that?
Go ahead.
Okay, well, maybe actually this is a good time to talk about some of your academic work. And I looked into it, and I don't know if I fully understand it, but your work on transnational governance models, and you've also talked about circumventing the state or non-state action, TMN, transnational municipal networks. From what I understand, this is about building governance networks across nations that are not directly accountable to overarching UN bodies, in this case on climate change, but it also could be the actual democracies you're talking about, the corrupt ones mainly. Can you talk a little bit more about circumventing the state just as an idea, and then maybe bring us also into kind of a real life situation where we can imagine that happening, even bringing it to kind of a design context, if that's possible?
Yeah, I can try. Yeah, thank you. So the problem is that if you would sort of make up an ideal situation, design in a way a solution for many of those global problems, you would come up with a top-down system. You would say, well, if there were a world government that could set global regulations, that would be probably fewer problems, right? So to internalize in a way those boundaries that we talked about, that the system always tries to transgress, and to keep them in there, is one thing that you can do more easily if you have a hierarchical regulatory structure. And we do not have that for all world regions or globally. And we do have it, in fact, for countries, but to varying degrees and with varying ideologies. So that means that there is a huge need to actually empirically research other options that we have. And you mentioned some of the empirical work that we have done with colleagues on some of the things that we call bottom-up. And that could be within specific areas like climate change or biodiversity. So more generically speaking about the SDGs, for example, where the idea is that you bring together society at large. So that could be governments in some cases, like a municipality, or a smaller city council or a region, and you bring them together with actors from the profit side, with companies, but also with players from civil society. It could be non-profits, but also academia, researchers, think tanks, consultancies, and these kinds of actors. And the idea is that you basically maximize the skill sets, right? Because they have vastly different experiences and skill sets, and bring a much more diverse set of interests to the table. And why is that necessary? Because that doesn't always work at the global level, right? So in the nation state, we have this idea that that's how we sort of, make compromises between different parts of society through different electoral systems. So that's sort of how we aggregate these preferences. But at the global level, that's not working. So there you need a second best, and that's often that you circumvent those boundaries and you create these networks among actors that basically want to get the same things done, but they would use different routes. And to give you a concrete example, cities have very early on in the debate about climate change developed much more ambitious strategies and targets, in fact, than the respective national governments they're situated in. So Amsterdam is a great example. Amsterdam does not only have a more ambitious mitigation target than the Dutch central government, it's also a city that wants to implement Kate Raworth donut economy. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the concept, but that's a concept of how you would actually measure an economy within the sort of fixed parameters of the Earth system. You make sure there's enough social space to develop. It's called the donut economy. And Amsterdam is a city that said, yeah, we will do that. It's quite a radical approach, how you measure, the means and the ends that I talked about. And cities can do that because they're both a bit further away from national government, and they're a bit closer to the citizens, where the real problems occur and the real solutions are. Because for a city, thinking about transportation, thinking about urban green, think about air quality, think about water retention, think about heat effects, they're all the same, they're all connected, and they all make sense in an integrated way. And that's why you get a lot of traction. And cities very early on realized that they can do that together. So why would Amsterdam need to figure out how we can cycle here if we can look at how Copenhagen is doing it and vice versa? And so we've done that in these global city networks where actually tens of thousands of municipalities are sharing experiences. And that is an alternative system of governance, of trying to get things done, than the nation state. It's not better, and it has its own constraints, but it's definitely an alternative in a way of a second best option, right? Ideally, we would have any of the problems because our mindset will be different, but we do have them. So then we need to work in the constraints of a fragmented international system where we have still governments that, maybe question climate change or are skeptical about it or don't really do anything about the implementation, right? And so we have to look for these alternatives. And you asked me for a design example. I'm not sure if I really have one, but I think what is important is to realize that a lot of the materials that designers would come in contact with, and one that I've been studying myself is timber, right? Is forest products. They have from a very early stage on been regulated rather transnationally. That's sort of across boundaries and without much of state intervention. And that worked pretty well. So one example is the FSC, the Forest Stewardship Council, that started in the 1990s. Because governments in the 1992 UN Summit on Environment and Development in Rio could not agree on a global convention, on a global contract among governments on forests. So a lot of bottom-up actors said, let's just do it ourselves. Why we wait for governments? Let's just do that. And what they did is they built a global regulatory system that basically takes a minimum standard approach. So if you have that label on your product, that is sort of the minimum sustainability that you can guarantee. And those rules, those regulations have been written not by governments, but by private actors. But the effect is very much the same. You do have these areas that are certified that guarantee a relatively low, but a minimum level. And I think so as a designer, you come in contact with these kind of products. And so actually you're part of these networks of second best options, but they seem very promising because indeed states will not for any foreseeable future regulate the way we think about timber as a resource. Yeah? So in that sense, it's a second best, but it's deeply, I think, intertwined with everyday activities. It's actually everywhere. These labels are everywhere from, anything you could think about, from coffee, tea, all the commodities, all use that standard, to the point where we come back to the greenwashing, because at one point, how much labels can a consumer actually still recognize? And the empirical answer is none. Consumers don't even know what that all means. But this is a different story, how that works. But that's in a nutshell the story about the second best that I studied a lot, and it does work to some degree. And I think that's the message that we need to have. Nothing is perfect, but there are these alternatives that work incrementally, and that's better than nothing.
We're actually running out of time. I think we're kind of getting to the end of it. I think we're going to give another few minutes if you want to ask Philip one more question, and then we're going to open it up to you guys to ask questions from the room. So we'll give you a few minutes to start thinking about if there's things that you want to ask. But I'll let you ask one last question.
I'm going to try to piece together what you just said, because it sort of brings me back to my last question on education, because what I hear in the labeling is that actually what you need to do in making these kind of transnational networks is to look at the situated realities of each local space. And I think that would involve bringing in a lot of collaboration and interdisciplinary experts who come into conversation together. So I'm going to bring that into an educational context where interdisciplinary collaborations as a university educator and for anyone in the room thinking about making systemic change at the university level. And by that, I mean shifting away from outdated and traditional knowledge systems towards design as an ethical practice, you know, connected to sustainability and all the things we've been talking about. I'd ask you, what are the key tools to get students from the outset out of the expansionist mindset in ways that also empower them? So I already know you talk a bit about co-creation, world citizens. I want you to maybe expand on some of those ideas. Yeah.
Yeah, great. Thanks. That's a really good, difficult question to close. Big one. So let me try to put it that way. I do think that the idea of a university, which actually says it already in the title, it brings together a sort of holistic set of knowledges in one place, is a brilliant one. But it has been quickly co-opted by specialized interests. That's why we have sort of, used a very reductionist approach to science, which is, by the way, terribly successful, right? You can break everything down in smaller parts and see how they work in isolation. Now, what we have missed a bit is to communicate to other researchers, ourselves, but also students, that science is there deep down an ethical enterprise. There is no way we can actually get away with this idea that there's some facts, there's some truths, and then we don't care about what they do, right? And even if you have a classical understanding of what science is, you say, oh, well, the physics, Einstein had the same idea. He realized that what he was doing is deeply unethical, and he regretted it for a good part of his life, and tried to redo that by becoming an activist and trying to influence politics. And that is important because that's not part of a lot of teaching. We don't often connect the science, the nitty-gritty parts, all the great papers with the deeper ethical questions. For example, means and ends is something so important, but we never talk about that. How is it that we can still teach students at universities about neoclassical models of economics, which are great theories? They're great sort of theoretical constructions without talking about the ethical implications that this has for real people, for you and me on the ground. And these debates are difficult, but they need to be done. And I think that's one way to advance education, is by being more open to these questions. And I'm not saying there's one ethic, there's one foundation that we can have, but we can have a dialogue about what we think are actually the ends. The university is in that sense also just the means to some end, right? I mean, in a way, you can say as la pour la, it's pure science, you just need to know those things. But deep down, I think most people agree that yes, but that serves some purpose. Either it's because humans are genuinely curious, or because we actually use that knowledge to improve the human condition and the condition of, the ecosphere and the biosphere. And if we ask these questions, we come into different debates about what we teach and how we teach. So that's a big answer to a big question, but that's how I would see that. And what concretely could be done in the university context is to make sure that students learn how to deal with differences in diversity, and not just in a theoretical and academic sense, so that you learn how you work with a social scientist. If you're an earth scientist, you learn how to work with someone from religion when you're a social scientist, but that you actually learn how to deal with that there are different interpretations of the world, and we need to find a modus operandi in which we can approximate some common understanding, right? It's not about your personal opinions, they're actually not that important to me, but how they affect the common good, that's really important. And we need to teach students, teach ourselves to get away from, I think a really big shift in the last years that we see is that each side of whatever debate tries to claim the truth, right? So we have fact checkers, as if there were these facts that we can settle forever. And then we have people say, you got the truth all wrong, I have my own truth. But that's really difficult also in academia. Why don't we talk about hypothesis? Why don't we talk about your insights and my insights? Why don't we talk about things that you say, this is how I see the situation now, but maybe you can convince me to see it differently. And this is a skill that you need to teach. That is something, that's not about something in the book. That's skills you need to teach students to be able to have that sort of conversations. And what happens then is like magic, because if you do that, you open up the space for where most people like to go. what does it mean for myself? How can what I do be meaningful in the greater context of what I do? How can I make better products, ideas that actually serve ends and just instead of being means? So that is the educational trajectory I see, which starts with an inflection and self-reflection of the teaching profession, which is still very much in the old model of sending, and then my truth, and you receive it, and then then all is good, and you do with that whatever you want. And I strictly object to that idea. We as teachers can at best enable students to make their own decisions on how they learn. And if we do that, then we can have those ethical debates that are, I think, at the center of what you discuss. So in that sense, design is, of course, an ethical profession in itself as well.
I'd just like to make that quick parallel, actually, to what you were just saying, because I think you're talking about science, but I think we often think of ourselves as a profession in which we're just doing good and not really so much considering that every decision we make also has ethical and moral implications. I mean, when you're deciding an ideal future, when you're designing a car and you're crash testing it with a crash test dummy that is the size of your average male, and you don't realize that, actually you're going to make a car that's going to be very dangerous for children and for women, that you're making a political decision, you're making an ethical decision that you might not even be aware that you're making. And I think that that's part of the self-reflection that we were talking about earlier, that design is also not a strict science in the sense that it's never neutral. There's always kind of a stance that's being taken in the way that you teach. We are going to open the floor up to a few questions. We have actually quite a few amount of minutes left, so I might take a question or two at this point for Philip, or just comments about the sustainability issue as it pertains to design. Liz has a microphone, so I will ask you to only start speaking when the microphone is in front of you. But at this point, I think, Russell, were you raising your hand just now? No? Okay, no. No, I'm not volunteering anybody, but...
Thanks, Philippe. That was terrific. One of the questions I always have about this discussion, and it's often the elephant in the room as far as I'm concerned, but it's the reality is the population has doubled in the last 50 years, and my question is that a wicked problem we can't resolve, and if we can resolve it, what role can design play in that?
Shall I answer right away? Or, I mean, it's fine. It's a great question. It's an important question. So, of course, the amount of people that need their needs to be fulfilled are an important input to any assessment of, what the system needs to deliver. So, obviously, a world with 500 million people could be a bit more wasteful than a world with 12 million people. And you already mentioned, of course, a critical component has always been in the thinking has been technology. So technology can then mitigate some of the increases because that can make things more efficient. The reality is often that any efficiency we gain through technological means is quickly eaten up by a surplus of consumption or a surplus of new ideas that piggyback on that technology, right? So in fact, an iPhone might actually be a bit more in terms of the battery, a bit more efficient than a Nokia phone from the 1990s, but you do many more things with that computer that you have. So actually it uses on total much more energy than any phone would. So that's one problem. So the mitigation of more people with technology doesn't often work. So then people say, what else? And then let's focus on people itself. I mean, that is a difficult thing to do because the way that works is, of course, the population is, so how population will develop over the next 30, 40 years is already decided in the past. So there's nothing we can do about that, right? Because that is already done in a way. The system is made in a way that has this big timeline. And as you know, population will level off mainly because of increases in education for women and the investments that have been made into that throughout the 1980s, 1990s, and later. So the debate, I think, is important, but it quickly shifts to the question of what type of lifestyle should be the model. What is normal, right? And if you look at the average consumption that we could allow ourselves to have, then we know that many European societies are far above the curve. So they have a lifestyle that does not fit into a sort of equally distributed use of resources, and others are far below, so they could actually be more wasteful. So that debate quickly turns into one about consumption again, and lifestyle choices and design options, of course, because there's so much past dependency. Just to give one example, I was fascinated with this idea that electric cars will solve any problem. It doesn't solve any problem. It just creates new problems. Because it just doesn't question the way we think about mobility, and that's the elephant in the room, right? To the point where cities, for example, have already understood that. So I got a letter two weeks ago from my city government that said, if you give up your car, I don't have a car, but they send it to everyone. If you give up your car and you share your car with your neighbor, we will reduce the parking price we have, and then you can share that together with your neighbor, so you both profit, right? To reduce the amount. Anyway, so this is something that is an interesting thing, how much past dependency we have in the system. So we will not be able to design ourselves out of there fully, and we will have to ask questions about consumption responsibilities, and they're difficult to do.
You just hit on exactly what we think is the way that we're going to be able to design ourselves out of it. Because, I mean, this is actually the kind of final point we wanted to get to in this discussion, is that it might not be, you know, replacing an electric car with the car that ran on gas, but coming up with this concept of how to have neighbors share with each other and how to incentivize neighbors to share with each other. I mean, I'm not going to say there was a designer somewhere behind it, but those kinds of solutions to problems are the kinds of solutions to problems that we in everyday life are used to doing. So I think the level of conversation that we wanted to have today was a bit this idea: we understand that the world is, the resources are finite, and that this classically expansionist view of make more, sell more, buy more, throw out more is a dead end. But knowing that actually the transition, I mean, today, tomorrow, we're going to talk about circular economy and reducing waste and whatever. I mean, that's the immediate thing that we can do today. But what you're kind of foreshadowing is that within the next, you know, decade, we're going to have to drastically reshape the way we live. You know, instead of us having one car, we'll share among 3 neighbors. If we, you know, instead of buying new clothes, I don't know what the solutions are going to be, but there's an element of that is the whole thinking of what a lifestyle is, of what we want. Because nowadays, I mean, the ad agencies are selling us these beautiful big Hummers and whatever it is, and we want those things. But I think there could be a point where, you know, ad agencies just as cleverly can sell us on this concept of like some other lifestyle that involves a lot less use of energy. Because what you're saying is essentially that, you know, we're way above the average that's possible, and many are below, and those who are below are probably not living all that well. So where's that medium ground where we can start thinking of sustainable levels of lifestyle that we can all have that don't feel restrictive? That's not really a question, but it looks like you might have a comment, so please go ahead.
I agree. No, I think this is a beautiful description of, I think, the ambition that shouldn't only be part of your profession, but also other professions, right? Like the academy, to think about how we can use our collective intelligence to get out of some of these past dependencies that we empirically know are difficult and dangerous. And then they actually are so dangerous that they undermine the integrity of the entire Earth system. And if you don't know what that means, it means like suicide. We are committing suicide on the planet right now. And we're doing that willingly because we do have the data to show it, right? So yesterday it was 5 degrees warmer in the Arctic than it should be. And 5 degrees in the Arctic, that's something that is so unprecedented, because that usually takes millions of years to get to that state. So if you're anywhere close to these research, people are not just scared, they're in blank panic, because what they do see is that the system changes so quickly, and it's a runaway effect. So we need to realize this is not an ideological debate, this is not a luxury debate, this is pure survival mode. This is just what we need to do if we do not, as a collective, it's not about me and you in the next 5 years, right? But as a collective, want to have any chance to have a decent future. What you say is correct. That's why we need to ask those questions which are bigger than, you know, electric car versus combustion car. What I just see is there are many more people spending their energy on trying to make the entertainment system in a Tesla work better than people that actually try to think about what models of mobility would work in the future. And that is where markets and means and ends come in, because we are steering the system in the wrong way. We use a lot of intelligence of people for absolutely useless purposes. Useless in the sense of the common good, right? I mean, people in many social media companies are really great in writing new algorithms to make us click more. But for what? And that question, that's the ethical question we need to get to, because if we don't, then we can design ourselves into more efficiency, but for what purpose? And that is where I think we need to change the debate. So I said at the beginning, I think you're ahead of the curve. You have all the right things in that sort of description of this panel. So I think actually that's why I think you're doing quite well in that. And no one knows how it needs to be done. So that's a common experiment. I don't have any recipe. You probably don't know exactly how we do it. But the only way to advance is to ask difficult questions and have these conversations. So I think just want to congratulate you again on this bold approach to question what design is for, right?
Absolutely. Before I close, were there people that were sitting in the room wishing that they had a microphone? I see Jonas making signs. No, you're just telling me to talk into my own microphone? Okay. Well, in that case, I think that brings us to the conclusion of the panel. Philip, I would like to thank you very much for taking your Saturday afternoon to spend with us. We really appreciate this outside perspective.
My pleasure. Thanks a lot.
All right.
Thank you, Anna.